Hey, so yesterday I interviewed Alexander Webb and Richard Britt. Alexander is a games designer, notable for his work on a range of mobile, online and console games. He's a designer and a 3D artist with an in-depth understanding of development and integration. He specializes in Unity Engine, Blender, Photoshop, Affinity Designer, photo, HTML5, creative writing, world building, game design, and technical integration. His new game, LITH, is a passion project in the world of horror. It's creepy, atmospheric, minimalistic, retro, kind of a maze, and it is available at the link below the description for this video. It's probably the only game I've played in the last few years, as you'll see from this video. My knowledge of games isn't very good, but I really enjoyed it. Richard Britt is leading senior programmer, notable for his work on the MotorStorm series, DriveClub, Onrush, Baldurs Gate 3, and The Angler for major studios across the world. He's worked for Evolution Studios, Slightly Mad Studios, Codemasters, Wushu, and Avalanche Studios group. He is at the forefront of games design in the UK, so who better to ask about horror games? Where do I start? How do I play them? Find out all about them. So I hope you enjoy the interview. Matthew at Pugwell316 page, Horror Plus, knows nothing about computer games, but loves horror, so I hope you like the video too.
I've already done the intro. Everybody knows who you are, knows your track records. And you have now got an incredibly difficult task of educating me on computer games, particularly of the spooky, scary variety, as I like to call them. So, Rick, Alex, where do we start? Let's start with one that I have very little knowledge of. In fact, none. I know what the box looks like. I've seen some clips. Silent Hill. Okay, so what is Silent Hill? Somebody tell me.
I think you best take this one, Alex, as I have not actually played it myself.
Oh, cool. I'm with you then, Rick. So, yeah.
Well, it's, it's not an expert. It's like Resident Evil, but not. It's basically a third-person kind of action. Not really action adventure, survival adventure, I suppose. And it's generally very creepy in a minimalist way. It's very much like there's just, a few well-placed effects, sounds, kind of creepy children talking, all those kind of unsettling things.
So was it like a haunted house kind of thing, or no? Am I getting the wrong end of the stick from the?
It's about kind of a town. I think it's been a very long time since I played it. So
yeah. Well, some of these, I feel like they are influenced by movies and then go on and make movies. And from my research, a lot of the movies that they make from the games are not amazing. I don't know if there's a Silent Hill spin-off movie or anything like that. I did see some. I think I saw a couple of Dead Space films, which look pretty terrible. But yeah, like speaking about that, the next one, the Alan Wake, that's kind of metatextual. From what I played it for about a week when on my Xbox 360 many years ago, and Alan Wake is kind of like. The main protagonist is kind of like a Stephen King wannabe kind of guy, if I remember correctly. I can't
writer whose writing is haunting him, I guess.
Right. Okay. I seem to remember really liking that one, Alan Wake. Was that a popular game? Were people into that?
I think it had a bit of a following.
Yeah. I like because the ones that stand out, and I guess you can both speak on this. Even I've seen the movie of this. I don't know why. Maybe because zombies. Resident Evil. Like that
Yeah.
seems to be like the franchise player of horror gaming. And maybe some others that I've missed. I don't know. Like that we maybe talk about as we go along. But Resident Evil's still going now. That's still a thing. There was a movie.
It's gone the whole. It's followed the whole arc of starting out with a kind of a gritty, kind of serious take, I guess, and that and a very kind of again minimalist horror, very Silent Hill, that kind of like. It does a lot with very little, and then kind of upping the budget for the sequel for Resident Evil 2, bigger setting, bigger, a bit more, and then kind of like going on that trajectory where it kind of winds between various different extremes, and then you get ones where it's like action comedy almost. It's it jumped the shark and gone ridiculous, and then comes right back round. Thinking it's 7 or 8. It's then tries to go back to its roots and be Resident Evil again. So yeah, it's been through quite a few iterations.
What's your experience of Resident Evil, Rick?
Well, for me, it goes right back to the beginning, because like the first game was one that me and my dad and my sister used to love playing over and over again on the old PlayStation. And I've played many versions of it over the years, but it like Alex was saying there, it's had so many re-releases and reboots, and there's been so many titles that I've only played like a fraction of the ones that have been out there. But I've enjoyed all the ones I've played, and one of the main things I've enjoyed about it is that it often has in the later ones co-op gameplay, which is quite a rare treat. Why be terrified alone when you can be scared with friends?
Oh right, so it's like a team kind of approach. Right, okay.
And you have to sort of survive the horror together. But it's set many of the standards, I think, Resident Evil, for like really good horror gameplay. You've got that kind of visceral body horror of the grotesque things happening to the people you're shooting. It's got that survival element where you're given like a limited control scheme and you have to do your best to survive. Like one of the things that stands out for me for Resident Evil is like the forced third person camera view for the earlier titles, where it kind of, you don't play from a first person shooter type of view. You have this kind of almost awkward camera position in a corner. You're trying to work the control scheme. And the earlier games had stuff like you can't do something and walk at the same time, and you turn horribly slowly, and all the zombies approaching you from some awkward angle, and you spend 10 minutes just trying to turn around so you can shoot.
Because the camera is not where the character's viewing, you get that horror movie effect of like you hear the monster, but the monster's off screen. So like your character's facing presumably the zombie, but you don't see the zombie, and that is really.
So that's intentional.
Yeah, it was a limitation of the technology at the time, because a lot of those games used pre-rendered backdrops. So the backdrop rendering took a long time to do. So they were basically rendered beforehand, and then you navigate them by an image is basically rendered out as a background. And then a sort of live 3D moves around inside it that's simpler, the characters and the zombies and things. So because of that, it would be prohibitive to then move the camera, because you'd have to redraw the background. So they basically set up a bunch of predetermined camera points where the camera would be, render out those backdrops in high detail, and then have your character move around relative to that to look like it's part of it, and some parts are cut out so they're in front and behind you and so on.
That's smart. That's really smart.
It was
a
brilliant way of doing it. There's a lot of games that used it. Final Fantasy VII used it as well. Like a lot of games in that era where they were pushing the boundaries of 3D, they used it to kind of have higher levels of detail than was possible with real-time rendering. But that effect did have this sort of unforeseen consequence of, or at least I think it was unforeseen, in that it did kind of create. It really lent itself to horror, because you didn't share the viewpoint with the character all the time. So there was surprises, and the imagination does a lot with the sound.
The player being limited, that speaks a lot as well for horror games. When I was thinking about the different horror games I liked, they often have an element where they kind of hold you back. Like other games, you're this sort of superhero. You think of like Halo, or you're kind of this mega warrior, unstoppable force. Where horror games, often the effective ones, they kind of tie your hands behind your back a bit, and they give you just enough to do what you need to. So Yeah, so you're kind of fighting against everything in it, and it kind of makes this underlying feeling of you slightly
That's
out
why
of
you have the
control.
limited ammo, limited kind of
Yes.
health pickups, all that kind of stuff, because that is what creates the tension.
So when they're all these zombies are piling in on you, and you're kind of, that's when people are like playing the games and just shouting and feeling sort of overwhelmed. I guess that's that kind of replication of what a small amount what it would feel like for real.
Yeah, I think there's also like different kinds of horror experiences, and like I watched a video a while back about someone talking about discussing the idea of whether or not a horror game the player should have weapons, because whenever a player is armed, it changes the dynamic, and there's a lot of good horror games which are examples of an unarmed player, and why that makes it scarier. But then there's also arguably good games where the player is armed as well. And it's that scarcity, I think, that can still retain that sense of powerlessness that then helps to create the fear.
Yeah, it's a different approach, isn't it? From like Rick was saying before about kind of just powering up with every weapon available and as a superhero kind of character and just blasting everything.
It gives you the whole thing a very different feel.
Yeah, there's no intention from the creators that the person that you're controlling is more powerful than the beings that they're fighting against. There's a completely different power dynamic. It's interesting, though, you were saying about how long it's been going. And I was thinking of like horror franchises like Friday the 13th and Halloween, and how everybody has their favorites and they often don't make sense at certain points in the franchises, and different companies take control and different people leave the projects. Is it ever a case that different studios start making these games and then other studios take over? Or is it always the vision of one big studio just trying to make as much money out of it as they can, and they have to keep bringing out new ones? Like, how does it actually work in games? Is it the same as like we have to bring one out, otherwise somebody else will take over, or like sometimes it is with movies, or
I think it's converging. There's a lot of similarities, definitely, but it's some franchises have done quite well in being retained by their studios, and they've kept them going. But I think pretty much every big franchise like that has probably been through at some point somebody grabbing the IP and it moving studios, or sometimes the studio gets kind of swept up by a different publisher, and then that changes the dynamic as well. So yeah, it's very difficult to be rock solid stable, I think, for 20 odd years and not have some change in ownership affect things. Often if they're attached to a creator name, like a sort of someone who's sort of well known, I guess, the game's attached to like Hideo Kojima or someone like that, then because that person is, they will change over time, but generally because they're kind of left somewhat to their own devices to kind of shepherd it a certain way, sometimes that, I guess, gives it a sense of continuity of, like
so do gamers follow those people like movie fans would follow directors? Like, would you guys have like you almost like, like I was saying, like maybe Scream films, like, oh, I liked it when Wes Craven did it, but then obviously passed away and different people are not as good, or I like this director. Is it the same in gaming? You have these people who are like maybe trusted people, or just people you have what's the word, some sort of like emotional attachment to because you've followed them from the beginning of their career?
Yeah, I reckon so. There's definitely ones that people idolize, whether rightly or wrongly, and there's rock stars of the industry which sometimes made a prat of themselves and sometimes made great stuff, and people do, I think, follow them.
Yeah, it's interesting that, is it? Yeah, in how you get these sort of like megastar people, and it doesn't matter what industry they're in, then they get that absolute power. It corrupts absolutely, no matter what it is that they're doing, and you like it can sometimes sort of temper the way you feel about a game or a person or a music or a film or whatever. It's something I never really thought about in games, just because I'm so uneducated on it, I guess.
I think that it sort of does exist within that, within the kind of gamer sphere of they're not quite mainstream really, in the same way as maybe like a famous director might be. But I think it's probably becoming more so. Like, I think younger generation probably would recognize some of the bigger names in the games industry more than they would have, say, 20 years ago. The other interesting thing about the the sort of Silent Hill and early Resident Evil tropes and like the way that those games worked is that they are so I think nostalgic for people who played them in their youth, that there's a whole subculture on kind of indie game websites of people building their own PS1 style games with all the same kinds of limitations sort of artificially kind of enforced on themselves to create that same feel of like a very limited motion, kind of awkward, bit janky, PS1 game. And that's kind of thriving. I mean, indie horror in general is quite big in games because of similar reasons, I guess, to why it is in film as well. In that it's very it's a very big open canvas. There's a lot you can do with it. But also, I think in games, it's easier to create a compelling horror game on a small budget than it is to say create a compelling MMO or something like that.
Yeah, because like you say, it's very open. Whereas certain
you can scare the crap out of someone with very little if you know what you're doing.
Yeah,
you don't need an expensive budget. You can just have all the right.
Yeah, sure.
Ingredients.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, because it's a bit like the sort of the advent of found footage films, isn't it? And kind of almost ties in. It's that they're even like, the found footage films where they've got a camera on their shoulder and you're seeing them in first person. It might as well be a game. So yeah, it's really interesting. So moving on to some other games and just kind of throw some names at you. And I know I've got some of them I've got like no knowledge of. So like one that I've got zero knowledge of is I believe both of you played this one, Bioshock.
Yes.
Is that one that's like a bit not as big as Resident Evil, I guess, or because I'm only going because I've not heard of it. But so the big games are ones I've heard of, and the small arty games are the ones I've not heard of. No, but but like Rick, Bioshock? How would you describe that as in comparison to some of the other games that we've talked about so far?
So it's a pretty big game. Bioshock is a pretty big franchise, but nowhere near the size and scale that Resident Evil managed to get to. But it's a very different kind of game. It's like a role-playing game. This one is much more about sort of item collection and leveling up your character and gear and solving a mystery of a place. I think from what I remember, the horror is mostly just from what's happened to some of the people you're coming across as you're going through. Some of the kind of jump scares and spooky claustrophobic sections you have to kind of fight your way through. And there's some plot twists in there which add a little existential dread to the character and what you are and what the heck you're doing there in the first place.
Is it post-apocalyptic? Is it or?
It's
no.
That's interesting.
I don't think
I'm
it's Fallout
sure I'd say that it's almost like alternative.
It's kind of like post-disaster, I guess, in the sense that you're going into this underwater city that was a thriving metropolis but has since fallen. So yeah, it's kind of got that post-apocalyptic feel in that sense, but I think the rest of the world is supposed to still be ticking beyond this place that you're in.
But for how long? ...
Indeed.
Yeah. But I would say like this game for me is less horror. If you kind of imagine the spectrum, it's more your sort of exploration shooter kind of thing with horror elements. So I don't ever remember getting like genuinely scared playing it beyond the odd jump scare that would happen. How about you, Alex?
I think it was the kind of horror that you often get in those kind of games where most of the things you're facing are, adventure, action, and then occasionally you'll come up against something like the big daddies, which just make you unsettled because they've been designed to be that way, that they're kind of threatening and big presences. I guess it's that horror elements that sort of surface from time to time.
So the story's quite the better ones, or the ones that are more popular. Is there a balance of story to action, or is there a real sort of dividing line between ones that are just very little story based and just straight into it, or ones that are like a whole big sort of lore and sort of mythos behind them? Is, you know, because I remember playing the first Doom when I was a kid, and all I remember of just playing it on PC at my friend's house was just like, oh, there's blood and we're shooting things. Like I don't know what it was about. I thought maybe it reminded me a bit of Red Dwarf.
Yeah, I think there's you've got the sliding scale of like horror to action, I guess, or like action horror, and then kind of gritty minimalist horror at the other end. And the more you go towards action horror, I think the less the plot matters or is there. Whereas if you get, sometimes, you know, you can have adventure games or walking simulators, as they're known, where the plot is everything, really. Like, there's not really anything else. If you took it out, there wouldn't really be anything there. Right. So yeah, I think there is a scale to it, but it generally aligns with that kind of how much action the player is doing. Because generally, if the player is running, gunning, doing Doom, there's not really the time for plot. And the Doom reboots lampshade this totally, because they're like, they fully recognize that nobody cares, and yeah, it just kind of pokes gentle fun at itself a lot of the time.
Right. I would say I totally agree with you, but there's exceptions to every rule. I would say for the latest Doom games, the newest one, great game, but went too much with the story and the lore. But the first Doom reboot, I don't know if I'm saying the right name for it, but you know the one, the newest one. What was great about that game was it was like this action-pumping fun, which seemed to gloss over the story, but they told it. It was all there, all the lore and the background, everything was there, but it's very cleverly put in there that it's not in your face. And so a player could completely ignore it, or they could pick up on everything and kind of piece together the deep background. And I love the fact they actually still put it there. Like, I think the storytelling in computer games has just gotten so good. It's got like a whole different level than when we were kids. It's really in deep. They go detailed lore. They write like lore Bibles behind the scenes that everyone has to kind of read and understand and follow.
Who writes that? Is that the people, the person who initially had the idea? It's like their little George Lucas style person.
Be, but generally in projects I've seen, they'll hire a writer a professional writer, who might run with the initial concept and then kind of make it their own. But I don't know how often it is that the writer's the same game concept found in the first place.
Because it's like I mean, I'm sure there are games that have like the writer's name above the title. All I can think of is like, because I know that Tom Clancy wrote books, and then it's like Tom Clancy's, and then I'm like,
Clive Barker is a perfect example of that.
Oh yeah,
he had a run of games. They were good fun back in the day. I've almost forgotten about those, but I do remember enjoying those.
He's always trying to be at the forefront with things, so much to the point where if you watch his films from the 90s, and certainly ones like people have tried to translate it, not necessarily ones he's directed, there's the industrial music and the kind of S&M and things like that from the they are so of their time, but probably at the time they were a little bit ahead of their time, if that makes sense. They were kind of a very they look, I can see a computery, because like steampunk kind of element to a lot of what he did and does. He's just he's somebody who isn't afraid to kind of just throw ideas out there and do things that other people aren't doing, and kind of get immersed in a world and then go and do it. So I imagine he probably just got really immersed in gaming for a while, and then was like, right, I'm doing these, which is pretty amazing to have the ability to do that. I hadn't even thought about Clive Barker, to be honest. So you've other games. I know we touched on, or I mentioned Doom really, but it is interesting. But I don't know anything about Fallout. We just talked about Fallout, haven't we?
Bioshock.
I talked about Bioshock.
Sorry, Fallout. Yeah, I get confused between those two games.
It's also a action kind of an RPG kind of storyline based game that has horror elements at times. It's similar to Bioshock in that respect.
Okay. So is there a thing where people pick up on a trend and you get like a bit like when slasher films got, and it's like, oh, this made a lot of money and it was cheap to make, and let's make and then do 10 years of slasher films. Is it the same with things like that? If a game, a new IP is like very successful, do you get knockoffs of similar things, or periods of time where everyone's making those games?
Yes.
Especially
in mobile games, industry in mobile is very much Me Too. It's everybody's chasing, but I think it's a general thing in most media, because a lot of companies just sort of look at what people are doing and go, oh, that's really successful. If we make it, then we'll be successful. But don't seem to figure out that it's successful because it did something before anyone else, not because it did something someone else did. Unfortunately. So it's there's definitely
it's weird though, isn't it? How that's supposed to. I was watching Halloween 2 the other night, and we're watching it for a podcast, and we'd watched Halloween 1 about 3 or 4 months earlier, and I was and you could see the amount of thought going into it. They were like, well, what do we do? Like, a lot of it was like, what do we do? Well, let's just start it where the last one finished and kind of see what happens. But it needs to have more this, more that. But essentially, you paint yourself into a corner. Like, a lot of the big creators only really have something to do with it up to a point, and then they just go, right, I'm out. I've got nothing else. But the problem is there is still a market for those people who are going, I want more of that thing, even if the people making them don't want to make them. It's a strange one, because I imagine there's plenty of people in the game industry making games that they are kind of maybe wanting to move on from and do something completely different, but they're not allowed to at that point.
Or they just, it's just kind of like doesn't make any sense financially to do so. But
your franchises, they get their reboots and their remakes as well. Like, they do try to every so often put some new life into them. But for the people making those games, they can get pretty tiring. But the industry does have people who will shift from studio to studio to try something new out. Though if you've ended up being one of the big names on that title, you might find it harder to do so.
Yeah, it's like footballers moving to a new club, and just what a new and the code is always like wanting a new challenge. It's like they're falling out with a manager, or they're sick of playing in a position they don't want to play in, and they go, I just wanted a new challenge.
Imagine that's what you put on your CV as well, right?
yeah. It's like just fed up of doing, So that's funny, because when you mentioned about massive franchise, I was shocked when I did limited research on this deliberately, so I can be the voice of people who don't know anything about games. But like, Doom is still going and still selling and still popular. Like, that's a game I know. I remember it being really scary. I know it's like people would laugh now, but like, the first Doom was really scary for me as a kid, because I didn't really play that many computer games other than my Atari.
Yeah. So I think at the time, to most kids, to be honest, playing Doom, most people playing it was scary, because it was just you had a different datum of graphics, and like your imagination did the rest, and it was enough to immerse yourself into the world, and it was I think enough to do that. But Doom did take quite a bit of a hiatus, I think.
Yeah, there was a long gap,
because it kind of followed the initial trajectory of when the first Doom came out. It was basically invented the first-person shooter, really, kind of, Wolfenstein. It was one of the very early ones. So that all of the tropes of the Doom thing of, like that style of shooter, which have now kind of been codified into the boomer shooter, or, the old school shooter. You have loads of health.
I've never heard
that. The enemies are coming at you from all angles, and you're often like bunny jumping, so you're hopping everywhere. You're, throwing around explosives with abandon. There's no hiding behind cover. There's no health regeneration. There's all these kind of things have been kind of clarified in hindsight based on how everything progressed from then. At the time when it came out, none of that distinction existed. It was just, this is the best we can kind of get this kind of experience of running around and blowing up monsters. So it started that all off, and then it kind of followed the footsteps everyone else was going through. It was like, well, what if we made it more realistic? What if we made it so that you actually, you didn't have like 100 health, you actually had to hypo and things, and no one likes running around after trying to find health packs. So what if your health regenerated? And all these kinds of innovations then led the shooter genre into the Call of Duty area, and then people kind of got into that for many years, and then kind of sat around and went, certain group of people went, this sucks. We've lost something fun on the way. Let's go back to Crazy Doom again. And then it's kind of resurfaced as this, kind of embodiment of that.
So people are into it again. Oh, that's really good.
It's come back. But I'd say let's not forget the middle one of Doom 3. So there was a big gap, Doom 2, and then Doom 3 came along. And I think one of the things, that was around 2004, and the company who made Doom, they're really big tech innovators as well as gameplay. And this was one of the first games that had like a per pixel lighting effect, which it meant it had like real-time shadows, proper good quality real-time shadows. If you look at the graphics now, they still look pretty old school, but at the time it was pretty revolutionary. And I remember I had some time, I fired that game up, played it in a dark room by myself, and I did get scared shitless playing through that one. It was mostly jump scares and the like, but it was immersive. And I think for me, whenever you go to a horror game and it's a new level of immersion you've not done before, I think I can really suck you in. So like the original Doom and all its cool 8-bit graphics, there was no other game like it. It was first person. You were the character. You could like see your own hands and stuff. It was like it was revolutionary and immersive. And then each time the tech kind of goes forward and it lets you be that level of immersed again, it's a new opportunity for you to feel like it's really happening to you, and you're in that horror situation yourself. So like we may get onto like VR titles in a bit, but VR titles are this another huge tech leap forward, where I've avoided playing some because I'm too scared to even put that onto my face right now.
Well, that's it. Yeah. You're actually becoming like a cyborg and putting these things in. Like, I don't know.
There, and it can be. I've heard of a horror game where you're strapped to a chair in your kind of Resident Evil, Silent Hill type situation, but in the game you are sat on a chair while some terrific thing is like coming at you from the sides and chopping legs off.
Clockwork Orange, surely. It's like your eyes are made to stay open. Jeez. This is why I stay away. Well, I remember when we were at uni, you guys you tell me about games and stuff, and I'd try playing them, and then I'd be like, it made me feel sick, and then everybody then everybody would laugh at me. But now you can see this is what I was warning you.
I know how you feel now, Matt. I know how you feel.
It's only going to get worse. And that was just like Sonic. He's so spiky. But like so we've kind of Doom 3, because you're saying like there's that kind of layers of fear and like it's kind of arty and cool. Did they go cooler as they went along? Is something like, because I've got one written down here, System Shock 2. Is that a kind of more arty, sort of cooler title? Did they go sort of more stylistically as time went on?
I'd say System Shock 2 is more similar to your kind of Fallout and Bioshock. It's like an RPG. It's a sci-fi one in space.
Bioshock was the sequel of System Shock 2, was it not?
Is that actually...
Or
is that
it was
canon?
not the direct sequel, then a kind of like continuation of a lot of the same. Because then you had Bioshock Infinity.
Yeah.
And there was, it was in some sense a continuation of the System Shock thing. I think that's where the shock part of the title kind of was meant to allude to. But yeah, I don't know if it's not a direct sequel in the sense of, I don't think it
like
shares
a spin-off
the same
kind of thing
narrative, but it was kind of like this,
like a spiritual,
trying to sort of take the same kind of gameplay mechanics, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
But you mentioned Layers of Fear just a moment ago. I'm not sure if that was as a title or as a phrase, but Layers of Fear, I think, is a good example of a horror game that is art and stylized.
Oh, okay.
So, Alex, have you played this game?
I have not.
Layers of Fear. Okay, so Layers of Fear is like a puzzle-solving game where you don't have a weapon. You just go around this rundown Victorian mansion, and you take the role of a painter who's trying to finish their masterpiece. But you are a painter who has fallen into madness, let's just say. And as you're completing the painting, from what I remember, I think you're basically filling it in with like bits of dead people. And you
Nice.
possibly they're your family.
Hellraiser.
I'm not
Hellraiser.
even sure. They're just like bits of gore, and you're going around this mansion, and like the layout's constantly changing, and the paintings are like changing into horrible things when you turn around, and there's ghost sections and pots and pans flying around, and puzzles you got to solve. But it is really beautiful. It's like a real artistic masterpiece. They've gone like the sound and the art in it was very high quality.
So is it quite gothic, like a sort of or modern sort of setting?
It's more of a period setting. Yeah,
Right,
so it's kind of
right.
like, I'm not sure exactly what like era it tries to be set in, but you get that kind of Victorian mansion vibe off it.
I was just saying with all the puzzles and things like that, I'm shocked that no one's made a successful game on the Saw films, because like I'm not a massive fan of the Saw series, but there's like so many films, such a massive audience, and it's basically problem solving. Some of it very ridiculous problem solving, and you know, a gamer could probably fix it in about 30 seconds. But I'm surprised that no one's kind of done that and made these kind of massive puzzle based games.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there is a Saw game, but I imagine that would work very well in VR.
There is a Saw game, but Alex, you're right, a VR game for Saw. No. It should be banned.
Yeah.
You're just like losing your limbs.
Also, because we were talking about Doom earlier, and we were saying about the layers of fear being in a room that rearranges itself, or in a house that rearranges itself. Have you heard of the Doom custom map? It was released earlier this year called My House.
No.
It was like an innocuous looking post on a forum of Doom maps, because it's still a scene going, people making their own custom maps, and someone had been like, I just wanted to make this map because it was like my friend's house and he was making it, and then he passed away, and I wanted to like release it to for completeness. And anyway, this map is like absolutely insane. There's a YouTube video I will link you, send you the link to it at some time. Basically like a deep dive into this, because it's an absolutely insane deep map that like you kind of go through a fairly simple thing of like someone's made their house, and then you go to leave and there's just a few details that look a bit weird, so you go back in the house and stuff's changed, and then you start going around. The more you push and prod around this house, the more it like has layers and layers and layers of crazy, and that like you get like the house on fire and people screaming, and then you kind of like fall through voids into like various other settings. And this map has just like a whole community of people that had like looked into it and found all of the stuff in it and everything. It's crazy, but it's amazing what even someone with a map editor can do with the Doom engine in terms of horror.
So that's just like a fan, basically.
Yep, made this whole kind of like horror experience on Doom through a map, because it just has a bunch of other stuff like loaded in it. And I think it was on like a Google Drive folder, which had a bunch of kind of notes that were sort of like done as, here's the notes on my map thing. But actually they've got like diary entries, and there's loads of clues as to the content of the map in those diary entries. So it's a whole experience that's been crafted. It's quite fascinating.
That's like the kind of people who, when I had my Amstrad when I was a kid, and people had give you tapes with all the little shareware or whatever, or discs and my Amiga, and like people, some of those games were really addictive and like really, really, just for free. Like people just doing these things for free. It was amazing. There's I don't know if either of you guys have seen Event Horizon.
A long time ago.
Because it is essentially, well, I was going to say 3/4 Alien, and then like a quarter sort of just batshit insanity. And there are these games that's like horror in space,
how influential? I'm just throwing this in. I'm not even mentioned to you before I was going to talk about this, but like, how influential was like the Alien series of films on gaming? Because it feels like it was kind of perfectly suited for Alien games. I know there is some Alien games I think that have been made. I don't know how good they were, but like in terms of influence more than their own games, if that makes sense. Or did people just go?
I think, yeah, they've definitely had a pretty big influence. I mean, most pop culture, big phenomenons like that have, because I think the majority of game devs in like the 80s and 90s were movie geeks, and they were into like a lot of this stuff. So I think all of that had a big influence. There was Alien games on the Mega Drive. There was a series of Alien games kind of running right through. There's been Alien versus Predator, 2 of them. Well, at least 2 of them called Alien versus Predator, and then there's Alien versus Predator 2, and it all gets very confusing. But
just like the films.
And then and then there's been Aliens, Colonial Marines, but we don't talk about that. And
well, Dead Space, I think I played that briefly a long time ago, and I got a sort of an Alien vibe from that. I think if I'm thinking of the right game. So that's it's interesting. There are some parallels, definitely, and there's a couple of other games that I wanted to bring that we kind of discussed earlier that I wanted to bring up. So there's I don't know how to say this. Do you just call it F.E.A.R or F.E.A.R? Forget everything and remember? No,
I think I always called it F.E.A.R, but
yeah, I don't know what. So that's a supernatural based game, is it? But actions in it too.
That one though.
Yeah, that one's is a first-person shooter. It's an action game, and it has. I think it was one of the first games I can remember that has a lot of supernatural powers involved. And the player character, for example, you're kind of hyper-powered. You slow down time was a big part of that gameplay mechanic. You got super good reflexes, and you're kind of fighting like psychic enemies and spooky ghost girls and that kind of stuff. You're part of like a hit awesome. Elite squad of who go around sort of sorting out all the supernatural naughty people causing trouble in the neighborhood. So you're kind of like
Ghostbusters.
But with guns and a kind of a badass sort of thing. I mean, it was kind of a fun game, but it was one of those ones that other than jump scares, it kind of failed to make me feel scared.
I've seen the front cover of it. I feel like I saw that everywhere. Because when you mentioned it, I googled it and I was like, I've seen that poster like all over the sort of game shops around the time, like a big red letters with. Yeah, what does that stand for? Do you know the F.E.A.R?
I do have it written down. It stands for First Encounter Assault Recon. So basically, they wanted the name F.E.A.R. They just made up an acronym.
Yeah, it's like Mask. Was it Mask? A mobile armored strike command with a K. It only struck me the other day how ridiculous that is. Nobody spells command with it. Yeah, I was just like, I used to love that, and I got all the comics and I bought all the figures, and I never questioned it once. Maybe because my spelling was appalling as a child. But like, it's like on your SATs, question 10, spell the word command. Excellent, know it.
There's another action game that you reminded me of as well when you were talking earlier, Rick, about games or like action games with horror elements. Half-Life 2, the Ravenholm section is another game that is largely kind of like, you're sort of like a varied action adventure kind of thing, but then for this one level dips into pure horror, and that's one where I sat playing it late at night before, and it really just
it got me.
It gets you.
It's unexpected. I think that's what makes it kind of special, in that you're playing a game where it's not that style at all. It's a big game, and then suddenly you come across this well-crafted horror section. It's terrifying at times, to be honest.
I mean, there's definitely there's creepy moments throughout. I think, like whenever you first encounter head grabs and stuff like that, and it was in the first Half-Life, I think, to a degree. But that level, it is like a deliberate, let's do a really scary horror level and make everyone shit themselves. That'd be great.
The VR version of Half-Life did the same trick in that I didn't realize it had a horror section in it until you're playing the horror section. And to put this in perspective, there is a monster, a big, invulnerable, you can't come anywhere near to killing this thing, monster, going around the corridors you're in, but it's blind. It can only hear you, whereas you can see it, but you can't make a noise. So one of the gameplay mechanics as well is that if you raise your hand to your mouth, you cover your mouth in the game, and you have to do that to stop yourself from coughing, because there's areas of the level you're in where there's like dust and smoke and gas, and your character will cough and get this beast to come near you unless you cover your mouth.
That must be pretty unique. That's not something that's like
it's never
standard thing.
It's not something I've ever seen before. It was absolutely a joy to discover and then terrifying to play through. There's a
I feel like as an asthmatic, I feel represented by that game as well. So, oh my word, that's it's just that little bit of extra creativity that is more of an idea than a technical thing, isn't it? It's like that's a kind of a story element, I guess, more than a gameplay. Or both, I suppose.
Yeah, they've managed to marry the two together, I'd say. It's very clever.
That's really good. So the only game I've got left on my list before any sort of honourable mentions, anything you guys want to mention? I know you talked about, Alex, you may have braved the VR world a bit more than Rick, I don't know. But was the Left 4 Dead, or Left 4 Dead, Meg Thregan. But yeah, Mithrigan.
Yeah, Left 4 Dead was like a genre, a new genre of its own. It was like a horror game where you play in a squad with friends, going against hordes of zombies trying to get to an escape route, a final area of it. And you've got like low ammo. You've got to really be tactical with how you're shooting and work together to sort of back each other up and save each other from the different zombie types. And I think the horror in that one comes from the panic of not being overwhelmed and having to work together. It has like less obvious limitations like some of the games we've talked about before, but this one, I guess the limitation is you can't do it alone. You have to work with your friends, and so you have to be an effective team to get through it. And
that's like a real zombie film then.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Yeah,
I'm guessing you've played this one a lot too, as well, Alex.
Yeah,
it got pretty popular.
It was, it actually reminds me of, it's in that kind of, because again, I guess you've got the spectrums of everything, but of zombie movies, you often have that kind of spectrum from kind of like the slightly goofy, kind of.
Oh, like Return of the Living Dead.
And then you kind of got like the really scary, bleak kind of zombie film, I suppose, that. And then, like every zombie film, sort of, they all fall.
Yeah, you've got ones that run and ones that shamble, and you've got
I think Left 4 Dead felt like it was more, I guess, because it was very action and very intense, and it was always up kind of thing. There was, I guess, it was less of the thriller, tense, scary kind of zombies, and more the sort of fun, let's kill loads of zombies with shotguns kind of zombies,
like the hordes.
Yeah, but then it's still in the horror category, I would say. But it was more that end,
for sure.
I
think I was trying to remember the name of it because I thought I played a game when I had my Xbox, and it was essentially a complete version of. It was like Dawn of the Dead. I was in a shopping mall. There were zombies everywhere. I had to kill them all. But you know me, like I give games about 15 minutes, and I just got really frustrated that they all just kept overwhelming me, and I just switched it off and got really frustrated and never played it again. But I really liked the story at the beginning, and we're in the mall, and it was almost like being exactly in a George Romero film.
Dead Rising, I think, would be the name of that one.
Yes, yeah, and I was just like, how have they got away with completely ripping off this film. I mean, I know George Romero was known for not holding on to the rights to things or signing the right documents and things. That's why anyone can make a Night of the Living Dead comic, cartoon, remake, colorized version, put it out on DVD, because the it was kind of taken for a ride by certain people or just didn't have that kind of business brain. So I don't know whether it was the same for Dawn of the Dead, but you'd think by then he'd have tied down all his property because he knew he was popular. But that game was just exactly the same story and exactly it was just.
I think games often can get away with that though, especially in the early days, because there wasn't the same level of awareness. Like they weren't as high profile. Like if you look at a lot of old games, even in the like the 8-bit era, for example, one of the huge current franchises of gaming is Metal Gear, the Metal Gear Solid series. Okay. And the cover for the original Metal Gear was basically completely ripped off a photo of Michael Biehn from Terminator, posed as Carl Reese. And it's like, there's a photo, like you see literally the picture of him from Terminator and the picture of the box art for Metal Gear.
Jeez.
And it's just the same picture. But it was the 80s, and like it was like 5 people making a game, and it wasn't anywhere near as high profile as it is now. So I think a lot of the time it was because I guess they just didn't think anyone would notice. And
I guess it was quite cheap, wasn't it?
Medium as well. So it's like it's not like you made a film that ripped off another film. You made a game that ripped off a film. It doesn't.
Yeah, because getting those licenses, I think at one point, I can't remember who it was, maybe it was Codemasters, I could be wrong, you used to just go over to America, pay for a title of a film that had just come out, and then make a game of it and just like cash in and on the when it was on the cassettes. I'm sure I saw a little documentary about it. It was quite interesting. It was like, say, the Batman or RoboCop, that was one, RoboCop on the Amstrad and things like that, where they'd just go over to America, buy the rights really cheaply, come home, and then just... Oh, it might have been Ocean. No, it was Ocean. I think it was Ocean, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated in how they just allow you to go off and do your own thing because it's a game and not a film. Like, just do whatever you want with our IP and our characters and our artwork. Just don't make a movie. God forbid, don't make a movie.
A coaster or something, they're just like, oh, you want to put Jurassic Park on a coaster or a video game, something like that, it's fine.
Yeah, it's like, if you make a game and millions of people buy it, that's totally fine. We make a movie and hardly anybody goes to watch it. No. We'll shut you down. So any honourable mentions?
Yes, I was going to say, just going back to Alien briefly. Mm-hmm. Alien Isolation is, I think, probably one of my favorite horror games of all time. And the reason is because there's 2 reasons I really like it. One of them is personal, is just the fact that they made the aesthetic decision to faithfully remodel and like replicate everything how it was on the Alien set, like all of the technology. It's all 1970s, it's sort of CRT sci-fi, I guess, is sometimes what they call it.
I like that, like The Fly.
It's like everything is, kind of CRT screens, kind of big, chunky buttons, stuff made of kind of all those kind of materials and style and everything. So aesthetically, the game is just like walking onto the set of Alien. Like, they just nailed it. It's amazing. The other thing that's really interesting about that game is the fact that it has what they call the AI director, which is basically the way that the alien behaves is kind of itself directed by an AI, and that is essentially used to try to be kind of like to act like a horror director. So it tries to make the alien do things that are going to unsettle the player. So it's kind of, you got this meta entity, excuse me, that's directing monster and is getting it to behave in such a way as to sort of produce the maximum disturbance. And it has kind of, it works on incomplete information. it behaves in ways that are just generally a bit unpredictable, and the amount of times that alien does just pull a surprise out of the bag when you're really, you kind of think, oh, I'll just do this thing, the alien doesn't find me here. And yeah, it's just it's kind of a great setup. The whole game, pretty much, most of the game anyway, you're moving through this space station with being kind of stalked by the alien, and a lot of the time it's not there. You don't, or at least it doesn't seem to be there. You don't have any obvious indication of it. It's that you don't hear it. You don't think it's nearby. And then all of a sudden you'll kind of get an inkling. You'll just like hear a door go, or you'll kind of hear it run across the vents above you, or something like that. And it is just an immensely unsettling game. And I've not died that many times in that game. But every time I have, has been the lead up to it has been absolutely terrifying. So I think it's kind of.
That's a new game then. That's quite new, is it?
It's quite old now. I think it's 2015, 16, something like that.
Oh right, okay. So it's still so it stood the test of time for you.
Yeah, so it's new to me in terms of like I'm not like current on those games, but I think it's one of the earliest examples of where I think game narratives are going, which is towards this idea of kind of like an AI dungeon master. Because I think the problem with narrative in games that has always been the challenge is that the writer's got to come up with a branch for everything you want to do, and the developers and writers can only foresee so much. So the player's always going to be railroaded into, do you want to do this or do you want to do that? And everything generally gets kind of simplified down for the purposes of budget constraints and the rest of it. To a limited set of choices, which often feel a little bit like I can be good or bad. I can be insanely evil, or I can be, unbelievably godly.
And the one that wins.
But with this, I think what's just starting to kind of come onto the realm of possibility now is this idea of having an intelligence that can kind of direct the flow of the narrative and the flow of the game and the agents in the game in order to like act like a dungeon master, and in a role-playing game who is basically can use human understanding and level of kind of like a director or a writer to make a world really interesting.
That really scares me only because it sounds like, from somebody who knows nothing about computer games, that we are creating an alien from the Alien films that can think for itself. which I have the same feeling about that as I do about Ouija boards, which is I stay away from them because I don't understand it. Which is kind of the same way that I feel about AI.
I mean, yeah, AI is. I imagine Rick probably knows more about AI than I do, to be fair. But
I am an AI. Yeah,
yeah. Rick basically
he couldn't make it this evening.
But I think it's fair to say that it's not often under the hood what people think it is.
Yeah.
It's mostly about
what I think it
looking
is
like the way humans work.
Yeah. I imagine it's a lot more to it than what I think it is. So Rick, your honourable mentions.
My honourable mentions. I probably have too many to mention, but there is one that is on the top of my mind right now. And I think, by the way, that alienization was a good example. It's a great example, that one. The one I want to talk about isn't even out yet, but I'm excited to play. And it ties a couple of things together that we've talked about tonight. So first up, have you heard of the back rooms? I'll start there. So this is something I found. It must have been a few years ago now. Just scrolling YouTube, and a little found footage clip came up. Just something someone had put together of a concept called the back rooms. And you watch this stuff, and he's made like a little lore. It's like a VHS tape that's been found, and it kind of shows these scientists exploring this area called the back rooms, and it's like a labyrinth of an empty office building with these ugly kind of yellow walls and fluorescent lights, but it's just like the layout's completely random. It goes on forever, and it's got some kind of sinister evil entity in there that kind of stalks you and will hunt you down and find you, and doesn't like people being in its realm. But the idea is that there are these like alternative realities that are just on the edge of ours, and all it takes is a small little breach or a tear, and you'll fall through into the back rooms or another one of these spaces. So it kind of took off into its own community. So people have made their own video clips and they've shared them online. Some of them are like renders they've done on the computers, and some of them they're kind of video edits from actual camcorder footage they've done themselves. So maybe they'll be exploring some abandoned place and they'll fall through the floor and they'll enter the back rooms and they're stuck there and they'll come to a horrible end.
It's a bit like Everything All at Once, the film.
But the horror version. Horror everywhere all at once. And some of the different spaces are interesting. Like they've got the pool rooms, which is just like an infinitely tiled, empty pool of different like slides and spaces. And they have one which is like a never-ending suburbs, never-ending hospital corridors. So there's an interesting game setting. And there's a new game coming out called Subliminal, which is heavily inspired from the back rooms. And if you watch the gameplay video for this, it's using, I think, the latest version of the Unreal Engine. When I first saw it, I thought it was a joke gameplay video. I thought it was just someone doing a camcorder footage in their house of what kind of game they would like to make. But after like a few seconds in, you realize, no, this is actually a real video game using the latest ray tracing technology in a realistic setting, and just that level of immersion, again, it could offer something really, really terrifying. But I love the way it marries like a kind of a community-made horror idea. It's not come from movies, it's not come from books. It's like a crowdsourced horror concept, which has become big enough and popular enough that now it's gone ahead to have its own like game being produced. I love the idea that can happen. You can have that kind of something that everyone's worked on, and when the game comes out you can all feel proud. It's not the first game that's kind of been made in this setting, but wow, the graphics for this one, I can't wait. People like it.
People like to watch videos on YouTube of people exploring places and going into places they shouldn't go. And I used to really love the Dead Malls series and things like that, and they'd marry the music up with it, and
it's got that feel. Like exploring dead places you shouldn't be, places that should be abandoned, but you're a bit scared that there's something there.
Oh man, I had an idea for a film like that. Then I realized that there's a whole genre of sort of found footage, kind of first person wandering around films, and I was just like, oh, I'm going to make this film, I'm going to write this script. And then I realized I think it's probably been made about 6,000 times. but it's what I like about what you were saying there, Rick, I think, is that everybody adds their own little tweak to it to make it completely, like you say, a collective or a community of people bringing it together. Oh, that's really
cool. What you're saying as well about like it bringing a whole like level of immersion. Just quickly going back to VR, what you're saying about some VR games. I played one a number of years ago now called A Chair in the Room, and is as minimalist as it sounds. It's very, there's really not much going on, and it gave me this innocuous command at one point where it showed it had like the cup, like a ball under a cup type thing, and like we swish the cups around and then pick it up. And then, oh man, I forget exactly what it was now, but basically it was like there's a black widow spider under the cup, and it's like, it's there because of the sequence of events, and then it's like, pick up the cup. And I'm just sitting there in VR and I'm going, there is no way I'm touching that frigging cup. Like, even in a first-person shooter game, like, kind of all that, I would probably be fine with that. But there's something about the VR setup that has like your full peripheral vision, that the feeling that you've been transported into this world, that suddenly makes you reluctant to do something that I'm not a massive arachnophobe, but I'm at kind of the level where if a spider crawled on me, I'd be like, whoa, and just brush it off. But I wouldn't kind of need therapy for it. So it's like a sort of average level of arachnophobia. But I could not pick this cup up. I was just like, no, basically take the headset off. No. Done, finished, and
the level of messing with you that someone could do while you're playing that game. If they played it before, they know about this spider cup thing.
Yeah.
Oh, the level of cruelty you could do to someone who's got their headset on.
Well, the simplicity of something is often the scariest thing, isn't it? Like,
Exactly.
just that is, you know, and people think that is easy, but it really isn't. It's really difficult to kind of distill something into its most scary or most effective or most visually, you know, it's really hard to do that. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it.
Well, it doesn't take a huge team or huge budget, but it takes, you know, the right kind of expertise, the right kind of know-how. That's why I think you do get that sort of big indie scene, because it's like if you get someone who knows what they're doing, they can do it without needing all that backup.
Well, speaking of expertise and things like that, you've got a passion project of a game that you've created that's kind of in the world of horror. Do you want to just talk a little bit about LITH?
Yes, so LITH. LITH was originally my submission to the Games Jam event called Ludum Dare. Well, apparently, that's how it's pronounced, and it was basically just a kind of a little bit of a retro thing. Again, it was kind of like, I think a lot of these kind of games, especially nowadays, are people like me who grew up playing certain kind of games are like, I haven't played a game like this in a while. It's just something very simplistic about a first-person labyrinth. So basically, it was a game where you're in this labyrinth in first person, and there are a bunch of these monolithic robot things called liths that were trying to find you and kill you. And it's quite simplistic, quite sort of again, fairly minimal. There's not really much to it. My brother, who is a musician, actually did the music and sound and the sort of ambience and effects and things, which definitely really helped with the mood. And it actually, at the time, this is quite a while ago now when the initial version was released, it was it rated quite highly on the mood and atmosphere sort of for this Game Jam thing. So recently I decided I was just going to update it and actually, you know, kind of make a version that people could play again, because the old version just wasn't available anymore. So yeah, I released that on my own kind of page on itch.io, which is a indie.
I'll put a link in the description so that everyone can.
So if anybody wants to try kind of running around in the dark, being chased by aliens with robots with big old red lights for eyes, then you know,
that sounds amazing.
Do.
I want to do that tonight. Not on a game though, for real. Thanks for that. So, Rick, is there anything that you want to kind of plug, tell us about what you're up to at the moment, or is it everything you're doing top secret?
Everything I'm doing is top secret as ever. Now, nothing I've been working on has been anywhere near the vein of this theme we're on tonight. So I think I'll hold my plugs back. It's fine. The marketing departments can deal with all that.
They can deal with that. Well, do you know what I was thinking? What would be quite fun at some point is if some of the games that you mentioned tonight, certainly some of the ones that I've never heard of, we got some clips of them and put them on screen, and you could kind of talk me through what's going on, particularly these sort of really strange VR kind of things, or maybe even some of the old classic ones, and just kind of show me how they evolved. Because I think we kind of followed a loose timeline, but it'd be really interesting to kind of have you guys just explain to me how that works or what that is. I hadn't heard of like 90% of these, so it'd be fascinating. And if there's people watching who want to kind of point us in the direction of other ones, maybe we could kind of do some exploring ourselves and find out about them as well. No, but thank you so much for joining me. I think this is the first time we've met. No, I'm joking. No, thank you so much for doing this, guys. Really appreciate it. I've learned so much about horror games. It does actually make me want to buy a console again. I literally haven't got anything, so I've got my laptop and I can go and download LITH and play that. But
you look on itch.io to their horror section, you'll find a huge array of kind of things that people are doing. Effectively, the indie horror game scene in full glory, and there's, I'm sure, plenty of things in there to play around with.
Oh, that's a good place to leave it. That's cool. Thank you. And I think you two should possibly just club together and buy me like the most up-to-date console. So we'll leave that there, though. All right. Thank you.
No worries. Cheers.
No worries. Bye.